October 5, 2003, a small floatplane landed on a remote beach in Alaska's Katmai National Park. The pilot had made this trip many times before. He wasn't expecting anything unusual. His job was simple: pick up the campers who had spent the summer in the wilderness and fly them home. The campers were Timothy Treadwell and his girlfriend, Emmy Huguenard. But as the plane approached the shoreline, something felt wrong. The campsite was silent. No one was waiting. No one was waving. No movement. Nothing. Then the pilot noticed a massive grizzly bear standing near the tents. The animal wasn't leaving. It seemed to be guarding something. At that moment, the pilot knew something was terribly wrong. What he was about to discover would become one of the most infamous wildlife tragedies ever recorded. Because somewhere near that campsite were the remains of 2 people. And the story behind their deaths was unlike anything most people had ever heard. The strange part is that Timothy Treadwell wasn't a hunter. He wasn't someone who hated wildlife. In fact, he loved animals more than almost anyone else, especially bears. To understand why he ended up in that remote corner of Alaska, we need to go back years earlier. Before the documentaries. Before the media attention. Before the bears. Like many young people, Timothy dreamed of becoming successful. He moved to California hoping to build an acting career. He imagined a future filled with opportunities and recognition. Instead, reality hit hard. Auditions failed. Jobs disappeared. The success he wanted never arrived. Friends later described a man who felt increasingly lost. He struggled with addiction. He struggled with finding purpose. And for a while, it seemed like his life was going nowhere. Then everything changed during a trip to Alaska. Somewhere in the wilderness, Timothy encountered a grizzly bear. Most people would remember such a moment as terrifying. Timothy remembered it as life-changing. Years later, he would describe the experience almost as if he had discovered a new purpose. From that point forward, bears became an obsession. But this wasn't the normal kind of fascination. Timothy didn't want to watch bears from a distance. He wanted to live beside them. Most wildlife photographers use powerful zoom lenses. Timothy often stood only a few feet away. Most visitors avoid close encounters. Timothy actively sought them out. Every summer he returned to Alaska. And every year he pushed the limits further. At first, people were shocked by his footage. The videos seemed unbelievable. Huge grizzlies wandered peacefully around his camp. Mothers with cubs walked nearby. Massive male bears appeared only yards away from the camera. To viewers, it looked magical. To wildlife experts, it looked dangerous. Park rangers repeatedly warned him, "Stay farther away. Don't become comfortable around the bears. Don't let the bears become comfortable around you." But Timothy believed he understood them. He thought the experts were too cautious. After all, he had spent years around these animals, and every year seemed to prove him right. Nothing happened. The bears didn't attack. The bears didn't charge. The bears didn't kill him. That success slowly changed the way Timothy saw himself. At some point, confidence became certainty. He began believing he had discovered something nobody else understood. He spoke about bears almost like old friends. He gave some of them names. He recognized individual animals and described their personalities. In interviews, he often talked about trust, respect, connection, but there was one problem. The bears never agreed to that relationship. No matter how peaceful they appeared, they were still wild predators. And wild predators don't follow human expectations. For more than a decade, Timothy continued living among them. Each successful summer made him more famous. Documentary crews became interested. Schools invited him to speak. Television programs featured his story. To many people, he looked fearless, maybe even heroic. But behind the scenes, concern was growing. Experienced rangers watched his behavior and feared the worst, not because they hated Timothy, because they understood how quickly a grizzly encounter could turn deadly. One mistake, one misunderstanding, one hungry bear. That was all it would take. Yet Timothy kept returning, year after year. Eventually, the impossible started to feel normal. The danger faded into the background, and that's often when people become most vulnerable. Then came 2003, the season that would change everything. At first, it looked like every other year. Timothy arrived in Alaska. He filmed bears. He documented their behavior. He lived among them just as he always had. But this time there was one crucial difference. He decided to stay longer than usual, much longer. As autumn arrived, most visitors left the region. The weather became colder, food became scarcer, and the bears became increasingly desperate to prepare for winter. Experienced locals knew this was one of the most dangerous times of the year. Some of the bears still roaming the area were older, hungrier, more aggressive. Even people familiar with the wilderness preferred to avoid certain locations during this period. Timothy stayed anyway. And somewhere in the Alaskan wilderness, a chain of events had already begun. Events that would lead directly to that silent campsite, to that waiting grizzly, and to the horrifying discovery that shocked the world. Because after 13 years of surviving among bears, Timothy Treadwell was about to face the one encounter he couldn't walk away from. By the early 2000s, Timothy Treadwell had become famous for something almost nobody else was doing. Every summer, he traveled deep into Alaska and lived among wild grizzly bears. He carried cameras everywhere and filmed nearly everything. The footage amazed audiences. Massive bears wandered near his camp. Mothers played with cubs. Sometimes the animals came so close that viewers could hear them breathing. To many people, it looked magical. To wildlife experts, it looked incredibly dangerous, because the closer Timothy got to the bears, the more comfortable he became. And comfort can be deadly in the wilderness. One afternoon, he filmed himself standing only a few feet away from a huge grizzly. At one point, he even turned his back on the animal. The bear did nothing. And once again, Timothy walked away unharmed. But every close encounter strengthened his belief that he understood bears better than anyone else. As the years passed, he began giving bears names and speaking about them almost like old friends. To Timothy, they weren't just predators. They were individuals he felt connected to. Park rangers strongly disagreed. Year after year, they warned him to keep his distance. They feared not only for his safety, but also for the bears. Wild animals that become comfortable around humans often end up hurting someone or being killed themselves. Yet Timothy refused to change. He believed the authorities exaggerated the danger. And for years, it seemed like he was right. Every summer ended the same way. Timothy survived, but nature has a way of punishing overconfidence. As 2003 moved into autumn, conditions in Alaska began changing. Food became harder to find. The salmon runs were ending. The bears were becoming hungrier. Most people avoided close contact during this time of year. Timothy stayed anyway, and the bears around him were changing too. The familiar animals he had spent months observing were disappearing. In their place came larger, older, and more unpredictable bears, animals that didn't know him, animals that didn't care who he was. Somewhere in Katmai National Park, one particular grizzly was moving toward the area. A bear Timothy had never encountered before, older, hungrier, and far more dangerous. The final days had already begun. By late September 2003, Katmai National Park was beginning to empty. Winter was approaching, food was becoming scarce, and the bears were growing increasingly desperate. For 13 years, Timothy Treadwell had survived among grizzlies, but now he was entering the most dangerous period of the season. This time, his girlfriend Amy Huguenard was with him. Most experienced wildlife observers avoided close encounters during this time of year. Timothy stayed anyway. In fact, after briefly leaving the area, he made a decision that would change everything. He wanted one more week, so he returned to the camp. What seemed like a small decision would become a fatal one. The familiar bears he had spent the summer observing were disappearing. In their place came larger, older, and more unpredictable animals. Then came October 5, 2003. Exactly what happened that afternoon remains unknown. There were no witnesses. No video of the attack exists. Only evidence left behind. Investigators believe a large grizzly approached the campsite and attacked. Timothy fought to survive. Nearby, Amy heard what was happening and rushed to help. It was an incredibly brave decision, but against a fully grown grizzly, there was little she could do. Both of them were killed. What makes the tragedy even more chilling is that a camera was still recording nearby. The lens cap was on. No video was captured, only audio. Authorities later recovered the recording, but it has never been released publicly. The following day, a floatplane pilot arrived to pick the couple up. Instead, he found a silent campsite and a large bear nearby. Authorities were called immediately. The tragedy shocked the world, yet the lesson remained simple. After 13 years, Timothy believed trust could overcome nature. It couldn't. The bears were never his friends. They were still wild predators, and on a cold October afternoon in Alaska, that reality finally caught up with him.